All right, get ready, because we're about to explore some really big potential changes in international finance.
Yeah, things could get interesting.
President-elect Trump's proposing a whole new agency.
The External Revenue Service.
The ERS, right. It's got everyone talking.
It's a pretty bold idea. You could say that. The ERS is supposed to collect, well, revenue.
From other countries, right.
Exactly. Specifically through tariffs, duties, that sort of thing.
So it's like an IRS, but for international stuff.
That's a good way to put it.
When you think about Trump's history with tariffs,
Definitely makes you wonder.
like all his campaign promises,
Yeah.
the things he's been saying about Mexico, Canada, China.
He's not shy about using tariffs.
No kidding.
And the percentages he's talking about are pretty significant, like 10 to 20% on everything we import.
And even higher for certain countries.
Yeah, he's mentioned 60% for China.
And 25% for Canada and Mexico. But how would this even work in practice?
That's the million-dollar question. The exact details are still kind of hush-hush. But it seems like the ERS would probably use existing channels to collect these tariffs.
Okay, so not like agents going overseas or something.
Not quite. Maybe they'd utilize the International Emergency Economic Powers Act.
Oh, right.
There's also been talk about increasing tariffs gradually.
To ease inflation worries?
Exactly, maybe like 2 to 5% each month.
That makes sense. But doesn't this kind of overlap with what other agencies are already doing?
You've got a point there.
What about the Commerce Department, the U.S. Trade Representative, even Customs and Border Protection?
You're right. There's definitely some potential for overlap there.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because this whole thing seems to clash with Trump's Save America agenda.
But what about shrinking the government?
Exactly.
Especially since he's got Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy heading up DOGE, that task force focused on making the government more efficient.
Right, the Department of Government Efficiency. You'd think creating a whole new agency would go against that.
Definitely raises some questions about how the ERS fits in with everything else.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just the bureaucratic side of things that's getting attention.
Yeah, economists are weighing in too.
Definitely. And a lot of them are worried about how these tariffs could impact consumers.
The price is going up.
Exactly. That's a valid concern.
And there's a lot of debate about whether tariffs are even effective at boosting the economy.
Definitely a lot of back and forth on that.
This is where things start to get really political.
Absolutely.
Democrats are calling the whole thing a multi-trillion-dollar tax hike.
Yeah, and they say it'll hurt American families and businesses.
Senator Ron Wyden, he's on the Senate Finance Committee, he didn't hold back either. He basically accused Trump of trying to give tax breaks to the rich and disguising it as the ERS.
Definitely some strong opinions out there.
It's a pretty stark contrast to viewpoints.
Yeah, some see it as a way to bring in more revenue and take a tougher stance on trade.
But others are worried about more bureaucracy, negative economic impacts, and maybe even some hidden agendas. And before we go any further, this feels like a good time to remind you to like this video and subscribe to the channel.
Definitely. We're just getting started here.
There's so much more to talk about.
Absolutely. And the ERS has a tough road ahead.
Especially given the current political climate, the big question is, will it actually happen?
That's what everyone wants to know.
And if it does, will it be the game changer Trump thinks it will be?
Or just another bureaucratic mess.
That's the million-dollar question. But one thing's for sure, this has sparked a lot of debate and speculation.
Absolutely.
Everyone's trying to figure out what it means for them.
For their wallets, their businesses.
Even for the global balance of power.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. Because if you look at the potential methods the ERS could use
To collect all this revenue.
they've got options.
Like what? Secret agents seizing assets?
Maybe not that dramatic. But remember that International Emergency Economic Powers Act we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Well, it gives the president a lot of power to deal with economic threats.
So the ERS could use that to pressure other countries to pay up.
It's definitely possible. And that raises another important question. What if a country refuses?
What then? Sanctions, trade wars.
Those are some of the scenarios policymakers are going to have to think about very carefully.
That's a bit unsettling. Sounds like the ERS could have some real teeth.
Yeah, it could. Which is why it's so important to understand what could happen, both the good and the bad.
Okay, let's imagine for a second that the ERS does become a reality.
Okay.
It starts bringing in all this extra money. Where does it go?
That's another big question, and one that Trump hasn't really answered clearly. Some people think it could go towards infrastructure projects.
Or to pay down the national debt.
Maybe even to fund tax cuts.
Which would tie back into his Save America agenda. But wouldn't all of that need congressional approval?
Absolutely. And that's where things could get really tricky politically, even though the Republicans control both the House and the Senate right now.
There's no guarantee they'll all agree on this.
Exactly. Especially if businesses and consumers start pushing back.
The ones who'd be directly affected by the tariffs.
Yeah. And let's not forget about the Democrats. They're already calling this whole thing a reckless plan that'll hurt the economy and benefit the wealthy.
It's definitely going to be a tough sell. Whether the ERS happens or not depends on how well Trump can navigate the political landscape.
And let's be honest, he's never been one to shy away from a fight.
That's for sure. And this is shaping up to be a big one. But beyond all the political maneuvering and the economic arguments, there's something else we need to consider.
Oh, what's that?
What the ERS represents. It's not just about money. You mentioned earlier that it's symbolic of a shifting global order.
I did, and that's a crucial point. We're at a crossroads right now.
Like the old rules don't apply anymore.
And we don't know what the new ones will be.
It's a time of uncertainty.
Absolutely. But maybe also a time of opportunity.
If we're willing to take it. So where do we go from here?
That's the question, isn't it? And I don't have an easy answer.
But maybe that's all right.
Maybe the most important thing is to keep asking questions.
To challenge our assumptions.
And to have productive conversations.
Because that's the only way we can hope to navigate this complex and ever-changing world.
Well said. And it's not just about the immediate economic impact. We need to think about the long-term consequences too.
Like what? What are you thinking?
Well, the ERS could set a precedent.
For other countries?
Yeah. What if they start creating their own versions?
To get revenue from us.
Exactly. And then we end up with this back and forth of tariffs and trade barriers.
Which would be bad for everyone.
No kidding. Global trade could slow down, prices could go way up for consumers, and economic growth could take a hit worldwide.
Sounds like a domino effect.
A pretty dangerous one. And it's not just about economics either.
Well, what else?
The ERS could have some serious geopolitical implications.
Okay, explain that to me. How so?
Think about it. If the U.S. starts using the ERS to put economic pressure on other countries.
It could hurt relationships and cause more conflict.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It could even help our rivals and weaken our alliances.
So the stakes are even higher than we thought.
For sure. That's why it's so important to really think about the ERS.
We need to look at the potential benefits.
And compare them to the risks.
And we need to consider the long-term consequences for everyone, not just the U.S. You know, what strikes me is that the ERS is about more than just money. You said earlier that it's symbolic of a shifting global order.
I did, and I think that's a really important point.
It feels like we're at a turning point.
Like the old rules don't work anymore.
And we're not sure what the new ones will be.
A lot of uncertainty.
But maybe also opportunity.
Yeah, maybe. But only if we're ready to seize it.
So what do we do now?
That's the big question, and I don't have a simple answer.
But maybe it's okay not to have all the answers.
Maybe the most important thing is to keep asking questions.
To question what we think we know.
And to have real conversations.
Because that's how we can figure out how to navigate this crazy world.
That's it. That's how we make sense of it all.
I like that. Thinking about the ERS, one thing that I keep coming back to is, unintended consequences.
That's always a risk when you're dealing with something this big. What are you thinking about specifically?
Well, we talked about the potential for, retaliatory tariffs from other countries and how it could strain relationships.
Right.
But what about global supply chains?
Oh, that's a good point. We're all so connected now. If one part of the chain gets messed up,
It could affect everyone.
Exactly. Businesses and consumers everywhere.
Higher tariffs could mean, higher prices for raw materials and finished goods, right?
Absolutely. And that could end up hurting businesses and consumers in the long run.
So it's not just about whether the ERS works the way it's supposed to.
It's bigger than that.
It's about understanding all these economic and geopolitical factors.
It's about thinking ahead, anticipating those knock-on effects, and having a plan to deal with them.
And that brings us back to the big question. Is the ERS a good idea?
There are some strong arguments on both sides.
Definitely.
On the one hand, the ERS could bring in a lot of money for the government.
Which they could use for all sorts of things.
Like funding programs or paying down the national debt.
And it could show that the U.S. is taking a tougher stance on trade.
Which some people might like.
But on the other hand, there's the potential for, disruptions to the economy.
Strain relationships with other countries.
And those unintended consequences we talked about.
Yeah, it's definitely a risky move.
No doubt about it. It's up to the policymakers to weigh the pros and cons.
And decide if it's the right way to go.
We've covered a lot today.
We have.
We talked about how the ERS would work.
The potential economic and geopolitical implications.
It's a complicated issue.
And this is really just the beginning of the conversation. As things move forward, we're going to see a lot more debate and analysis.
And we'll be here to break it all down for you.
Absolutely, because this goes beyond just a new government agency. It's about the future of global trade.
And how the U.S. will shape that future.
Exactly.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today.
Thanks for having me.
We hope you learned something from this deep dive.
And that you'll keep thinking about these important topics.
Until next time.